So we're going to talk first about JavaScript statements. And we kind of already know a lot of this stuff, but we're just going to kind of review some stuff so that when we get into writing our P5 code, it'll make sense. So if you guys have questions while I'm going over this, let me know, but I'm just going to kind of go through this kind of quickly so we can move over to P5. But of course, stop me if something doesn't make sense. I'm going to do some stuff in the console today. So here's a reminder of our the way we open the console with our shortcuts. So you can see I'm on a Mac right now, so I'm doing Command Option and J. And if I was on a Windows, I would do Control Shift J, but I'm not. I'll probably be on a Windows on Wednesday, so we'll see that again. And then, of course, I can also just right click and go to Inspect, and then go over to the console. And I can also go to this like little menu over here and go down to Tools and go to Developer Tools, and that'll bring up maybe the elements or whatever, but you can just change over to the console. So I'm just going to do a couple basic things. So what we're learning today is creating a variable, and I'm going to go over more detail about what this means, but this is how we create a variable in JavaScript, or at least one way to do it. And so just to go over the syntax of this statement, it starts with a keyword. It's a little bit different than some of the code that we've been writing so far this semester because we've just been using mostly P5 functions. But this is actually like what code generally looks like. It usually has like a lot of statements like this. So for this statement, I'm saying I'm creating a variable and I'm calling that variable sentence. And then I'm assigning the variable to a value. And the value is this string, hello world. And what this basically does is it creates a little space in memory and gives it the name sentence. And it uses this equal sign. This is called the assignment operator. I'll sometimes just say gets instead of equals because it's really closer to like getting a value than it is necessarily equaling a value. And the value here is just a string of data. So it's just these characters, it's these letters, which the computer just sees as data. And so notice that like my data is inside the quotation marks because it's a string versus the name of the variable that I'm creating is not in quotation marks because it's just my variable name. So that's kind of the different syntax we have. We have the keyword, we have the name of the variable we're creating, an operator, and then we have data. And of course, in JavaScript, we end our statement with a semicolon. And so when I execute that statement in the console by hitting enter, you can see I now have this thing called sentence, which previously did not exist. And if I bring that up and hit enter, the computer remembers the data that I put in there. Um, and so a couple things on syntax in JavaScript. If I say something like this, variable sentence, and I put like a million spaces right here, and then say gets hello world, these spaces don't matter. There has to be at least one space here between sentence and equals. Actually, there doesn't have to be, but there should be. One of the kind of confusing things about JavaScript is there's a difference between like the functional syntax versus the aesthetic syntax. So some things are rules that just make things easier to read and look better, but some things are rules that actually break your code. And so here, if I put a bunch of space here, it doesn't really care. It still does the exact same thing. It assigns this data to sentence. But I can say like this, variable sentence equals hello world without any spaces there. That doesn't break my code because it can tell that, this operator separates these two pieces of code, this variable name and this data. Where I would get in trouble is if I said this variable sentence. So if I try to declare a variable just by saying the keyword var directly followed by the name of the variable sentence, I can't do that because it doesn't know what's happening. It doesn't know that sentence and var are separate things. And so if I try to do this, well, it's still hello world because I'm still in the same thing. So let's do a different example. Let's do var. Oh, actually, you know what? I'm not going to get an error here. Let's say if I say var sent equals hello world. This is now there's this thing called var sent because JavaScript actually lets you declare variables without keywords, which is not always the best practice. But anyway, normally you don't want to do this. You want to have a space here. but yeah, having a space in between the operators is kind of the convention. If we put spaces in our data, that will get saved. So if I say var sentence and I say equals hello, and I put a bunch of spaces here, that's actually part of the data. So that will be part of our data that we've saved. So you can see that this hello world actually has a bunch of spaces in it, even though in our JavaScript syntax, it ignores those spaces. So that's the difference between the data we're working with and the code we're actually writing. So as I mentioned, the assignment operator is the equal signs. We assign values to variables. And as I mentioned, I usually say gets when I write. If I say like, if I'm, explaining some code and I say like var x gets 1, I'll usually say gets instead of equals because that's closer to what's actually happening here. The value 1 is getting put into this bucket called x, is usually how we talk about it with programming. So variables, again, we just use var, which is shorthand for var, and then we come up with a name for the variable. The name has to be one word, essentially, one chunk, but it can have multiple words in it. It just can't have spaces. So I can't have a variable that's like my variable. It won't let me do that. So what I would do instead is variable my variable like this. And then some languages use different conventions, like some languages would be like this, some languages would be like this. But JavaScript, what they do, if you want a second word, since I can't use a space here, what I use is a capital letter. That saves adding space, but still makes it readable. So I can say var my variable, and this variable now exists, but I didn't assign anything to it, so it's just undefined. Um, so again, this is just kind of going over the basics. You'll see examples of this, and it'll make a lot more sense. Um, so what I just mentioned is I can declare a variable without assigning it, and these are two parts. So if I say variable a, ignore that. That's like something that I wrote before. So A now exists. A is a variable, but it's undefined. B, I haven't defined. So if I say B, that's an error. There is no B. But since I've said variable A, it doesn't have any data in it, but it does exist. Then if I assign some data to that variable, if I say A equals 10, now A has a value. So that's actually two parts to any creating a variable. There's a declaration, which says it exists, and then there's assignment, which gives it a value. Most of the time when you create a value, you do both of them at the same time. So we do the declaration, we'll say variable b, and we also assign it a value. So we can say b equals 2, and now I have this b that equals 2. So yeah, that's VAR. Uh, and so when we do both at the same time, that's called initializing a variable. So these are all very big words that just kind of refer to specific things that we do in code. It can be a little confusing at first because you may not really use words like this in your day-to-day life. But one of the things with programming is that in order to talk about programming, it's useful to have like highly specific words so that we know what we're describing. So we know there's a difference between declaration and assignment of a variable, and then we know that initialization or initializing a variable means doing both of those things at the same time. So we've already talked about data types, so I'll go through this really quickly, but we have some basic data types, numbers and strings. We have numbers, which are, like numbers. We have strings, which are like strings, strings of letters. Uh, we have something called not a number, which is something you'll see on Wednesday when we do um, our debugging exercise. So if let's say I have a variable a and I assign it the string 10. So we as people can look at this and know that this means the value 10, but the computer doesn't see that. It sees ten. It doesn't see like the number 10. So what if I tried to add, or let's actually do multiply. Let's say I tried to multiply 10 by 10. That's when I get not a number. So JavaScript here is telling me that a is not a number, and therefore I cannot do multiplication. This gets a little confusing with concatenating strings, which I'll talk about in a second. But just in general, know that if you see nan in your console and your program isn't working, that's what's happening, is that you're trying to use something that's not a number. We can check the types of data by using type of. So if I say type of A, it'll tell me that's a string. If I say type of 10, it'll tell me that's a number. If I say type of true, it'll tell me that's a Boolean. And let's see, if I say type of, what do I get if I say type of, let's use the document. So if I say type of document, that's an object. We probably won't talk about that for a while. And if I say type of, what if I say type of var? It says it doesn't like that, unexpected token, so we can't do that. Um, so yeah, so strings are strings of characters. They're usually used to store messages or data, and we can add strings together. So that's where things can get confusing. So let's say I have a greeting like greeting equals hello, and I have a name like name equals Jerry. And I can add these together. I can say greeting plus name. And it's just going to add those strings together. It doesn't really look like what I wanted it to do, so I need some more stuff in there. I can say greeting, and then I can add another string here, and then add name. And so what I'm doing here is I'm adding the greeting, hello, plus this little comma to separate the greeting from the name, and then I'm adding my name again. So when I use strings, when I use math with strings, when I use like the plus operator, what I'm doing there is actually called concatenation. It's not the same thing as adding numbers. Um, so yeah, let's keep going. So we've already talked about this, but um, well, let's just go over it. So we're going to come back to this in just a second. So just reviewing, so if I say variable a equals 0, what I'm doing there is I'm initializing a value, I am declaring the variable a, and I'm assigning the value 0. And then I can change a. One of the things that we'll talk about is that variables can change. That's why we call them variables. So we can assign it a value, but then we can change that value later. And so that allows us to do a lot of really cool things that we'll get into next week, where we can do animation and interaction and stuff like that. So I can change a value. I can do math on the other side of this operator. So I can say a equals 10 plus 20, and that gives me 30. And it also assigns the value to a. So this looks pretty simple, but it's actually doing two different things. It's adding this number here, but then it's also assigning that number back to the variable that we created. Um, and then we can also just have expressions. A equals 10 plus 20. So this is not a mathematical expression. It's not going to evaluate it for us. It's just some text that sounds like a mathematical expression to us. So we have different operators. We have the assignment operator, which is not really like math. It's just assigning a value. But then we have math operators. So we can say x plus y, that gives us 30, x minus 5, that gives us 5. But notice when I type in x, it's still 10 because I haven't assigned anything back to x. I'm just doing math with it. So assignment and doing these operations are different components. Multiply and divide, we already know about that. Here's what I was talking about before, concatenation. Concatenation is essentially adding the two strings values together. So when we did our, where is it? I'm hitting the up key, by the way, to cycle through things that I've written before. So we have our greeting plus our name. Again, we get hello Jerry with no space in here because it just sees the greeting hello and the name Jerry. It doesn't really know that I'm like trying to do, to write a phrase. So if we want to write a phrase, we have to actually add in our own comma there as its own separate string. So when I add strings together, it's called concatenation, but I obviously can't multiply or divide strings. I wouldn't know what to do with that. Another operator that we're going to use a lot as we go through the semester is called increment or decrement, and this is when we just add to a value. So if I have variable x equals 10 and I say x plus plus, it's going to increase the value of x by 1. This is a shorthand that is so common in programming that they just made a really quick way to do it with this x plus plus. But what this really means is x equals x plus 1. X plus plus is a shorthand for x equals x plus 1. So we're taking the value of x and adding 1, and then we're assigning it back to the variable x. So that's going to give us 12. And I can also say x plus equals 10. That'll give us the value 22. So this is another shorthand, but instead of just plus 1, it's adding whatever this value is here. And then we can subtract. We can do x minus minus, which will be 21, or x minus equals 5, which will give us 16. I think there's one more bit. Yeah, addition versus concatenation. So this is kind of what I've been talking about. This isn't like super relevant, but you'll run into this from time to time. So if I have a variable x that equals 1, and I have a different variable y that equals the string 7, even though we can see that this is a number and this is a number, since we put quotation marks here, JavaScript sees this as a string, not a number. And so if I say x plus y, something kind of weird happens where, or sorry, x plus y. This weird things happens where instead of giving us the real value 8, which is what 1 plus 7 would be, it turns 1 into a string, and then it does concatenation. And that's how we end up with 17. So 1 becomes a string when we try to add it together, and then we get 17. So obviously 1 plus 7 is 8, but if 7 is a string, we get this 17 here. So that can be a little confusing. You might run into that. And if we look at type of x plus y, look at that. That's even weirder because we think that it's going to tell us a string, but type of x is actually a number. That's just the string number when we say type of x. And then 7 is still just the string 7. So we get number 7 here. If I say type of, and then I put parentheses x plus y, then it's going to tell me it's a string. If I do y plus x, that gives me 71. It does the same thing, but it's in the reverse order. So it seems like it's doing math, but it's really just adding these characters together. And one way I can fix this is I can cast y as a number. So I can put y inside of this little number function, and that'll give me a regular number. So x plus number y gives me 8. And then I can also just use the plus operator. This is probably getting a little into the weeds, but if I do a little plus before my value, that also will cast it as a number. And cast just means turning the value into a number. But this won't work if your string is not a number. So if I say like x plus equal or plus number of hello, that's obviously not a number. It can't get any number value out of it. But JavaScript is smart enough to get a number out of like this, or even like this, but it wouldn't be able to get a number out of like that. Yeah, you'll see this maybe in if you get some errors. I guess in P5 you might run into that if you're trying to put like different colors and stuff and you make them strings versus numbers, you might get some errors that way. So that's everything I wanted to cover in terms of syntax. Now we're going to get into actual variables, and I'm going to open up P5 in order to do some examples over there as well. So any questions? Oh, I want to go to the editor. Any questions on any of that syntax stuff before we move on to P5? Okay, cool. So I'm going to do a self-portrait with variables. So we're going to redraw our self-portrait, but this time we're going to use variables, and that's going to make it possible for us to do some really cool stuff that we can't do with just what's called hard data, just numbers. So it's going to be a little boring at first getting it set up, but then it's going to be worthwhile. So let's go back to week 3, and we're going to go to variables. And I'm going to put this into the chat if you guys want to look at this. Yeah, I'm going to get rid of the console because we're going to write some stuff into the editor. And so I'm just going to make a little comment here first to get started. So remember, your program always should start with a multi-line comment that contains, any information that's relevant to what the program is doing. So this is my self-portrait version 2 using variables. And so we're going to use this as a practice for creating a self-portrait with variables. And there's a couple different ways that we can do this. One is we can take the self-portrait we already created and try to just put in variables. That is a good way to kind of like learn how things fit together. But what I want to do instead is is redraw it from the beginning with variables as this kind of like paradigm for how I want to be doing it. Um, so I'm going to open up another tab and just open my self-portrait so I have it as a reference. But if it doesn't end up looking exactly the same, that's okay. What I really want is just for it to be recognizable. So I can't find it. I'm going to go to my collections and hopefully I put it in there. Yes, I did. Here's self-portrait version 1. And there we go. There's my self-portrait. And so I'm going to start with this as a baseline. But if it doesn't end up looking exactly the same, that's okay. And actually, one thing that's a little bit different about this self-portrait than what I've done in the past is there's actually kind of two parts here. There's the guy's head, and then there's the computer. Usually, I just have like a person. So that's kind of interesting. I'll try to play with that as I'm working on this. So self-portrait version 2 by Owen Roberts, and the date is the 19th. Oops. Okay. So now we're going to talk about some more definitions. So as we have seen in that little syntax overview, JavaScript kind of contains a few different basic types of like text that you would see in the code. There's the keywords, things like function, so like the function here, things like var that we just see that are defined by the language. So I can't really use function anywhere else except for when I'm declaring a function. Then there's variable names. These are words for functions or variables that we create in our code. So there's already some built in here: setup, create canvas, draw, background. These are function names that P5 has defined for us. We're going to be defining our own variable names today. And functions and variables in JavaScript kind of are interchangeable in a way. But variables usually refer to just like a piece of data, whereas a function is usually like its own whole code block, like we see here. And then the last bit is hard data. So that's things like these numbers and strings that we use to create like colors and stuff like that. That's all referred to as hard data. That means it's like information or data that doesn't change. So we're gonna basically add some variables to the way that we create our self-portrait. It's gonna look a little bit different than what I did here. So what I did here, this is like just an example. I created this simple self-portrait, and you can see everything here is a number. And what I did in this kind of like example notes is I went through and I analyzed the self-portrait and I replaced everything that was originally a number with a variable. And so what I end up with is I create like a variable for like the eyes or the face, and then I put those into the arguments for my different P5 functions. So this is still a good way to do this. So I'll leave this here for you guys to review. But what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to start from scratch and just describe how I can use variables to change the way that I draw my self-portrait, and then just go from there, basically. So let's talk a little bit about what a variable is, and then we'll get into writing some code. So on a technical level, let me get my little, oh, I already have it open. Okay, let's go to, I have to do this. Okay. So let's turn off. So on a technical level, a variable is just like a piece of memory on the computer. So if we imagine our computer has a hard drive and that has like permanent memory, and it also has RAM, which is random access memory, which is memory that's just being used that gets deleted afterwards when you're done using it. Uh, so we have two different types of memory on the computer, but they kind of act the same way. So it doesn't really matter which one we're using, but just imagine that this is like a little piece of memory on the computer. And each one of these little cells might have like a 0 or it might have a 1. That's basically it. It doesn't have anything more than that. But then when you add them up together, like if I have like 6 cells in a row for a hex value, or actually not, if I have a hex value, I have whatever, a huge number of cells, but that's okay. If I have one row of a hex value, that's 8. So, this might be one of our hex values. So let's say we have a color, do I actually have 8 here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I do. Nice. So let's say I have 0, 1, 1, 0, blah, blah, blah. This is like 1 byte, right? On the computer. This is a byte, or no, this is a bit. This is a byte. This is a byte of information here, and each one of these is a bit. Okay, so a bit is a 0 or a 1, and a byte is 8 of those. And if I have 8 bytes, or 8 bits as 1 byte, I can express values between 0 and 255, which is also what I can do with a hex value. So like if I have this color um, here, this represents 3 different bytes. So FF is like full, that's like fully red. C3 is like some amount of green, and 00 is like no blue. So if I'm saving this in my memory, I would have I would have 1 byte just for the FF, and that would probably be like 11111, all ones or whatever. So that's what the computer memory looks like, but that's all really confusing and crazy. Like we would not be able to write code if we had to do it like that. So what we do instead is we decide what we want something to be. So let's say we want a color for the face. I would create a variable. I would say like var, that's not easy to see. Let's go over here. I would say like var face color, and then equals, and then we have like FFC300. That's the face color. And our computer would just say like, okay, here's a random little bit of memory. We're going to stick this in there. And you just have to call it face color. You don't have to remember what all these crazy numbers are. And so that way we can just apply our face color value whenever we want to paint the face or anything that is the right color. And we can do that with any piece of data, anything that we want to remember over time for the computer to recreate. We can do it using variables. So that's basically what a variable does on like a really simplistic level is it chooses a random piece of memory in your computer and it assigns it the values that we want it to remember. And then when we say face color, it goes back to that same place and it grabs those values for us. So that's what a variable does. And again, you can kind of think it as like a nickname. So like if you have, in this example, I'm saying it's kind of like having nicknames or names for your friends. If you have a story that involves a few of your friends, you might have like the story might be something simple like Jerry and Jenny went to the park one day and met their friend Nick. So that story makes sense because we understand that Jerry, Jenny, and Nick are distinct people. The story would not make sense if you don't know who they are, if you don't have names for them. So if it was like a person and another person went to the park and met another person, that wouldn't really make any sense because we don't distinguish between the different people, the different pieces of data. So a variable is kind of like a nickname for a piece of data that we want to use in our story or in our drawing or in whatever we're creating on the computer. So I'm gonna recreate my self-portrait, but instead of just like going through my self-portrait and replacing all these numbers with variables, which is one way to do the assignment and how we have done the assignment in the past, instead I'm just gonna think through what the thing looks like and then try to create variables that represent the components that I need. So I'm just gonna start here. I'm gonna draw a little bit on this. Um, and figure out what do I need for my variables. So I'm just going to start with the face. So I have this like face here. And if I want to draw this face, I need to know where the center is. So I'm going to have a center and I'm going to call that like X and Y. I'll just use XY for that. And then what I want to do is base everything off of the center because ultimately what I want to be able to do with my self-portrait is move it around on the screen or at least move components of it around on the screen. And so I want everything to be based on this center position, as well as I know like the width of this face and I know the height of this face. And if I do that and I use some simple math, I can figure out where to put everything else. So for example, I can figure out how far up to put the eyes from the center and how far over to put them, and then I can use those same numbers to apply to the eye and the glasses and this whole section. And then I can do the same thing with the hair. I can use a variable to say like where the hair starts and how far it goes down. So I can make adjustments really easily. One of the things that'll be tricky as you first start learning variables is that they can really do a lot of different things. So I'm just going to give a few examples of the types of things that they can do. But what I'm trying to show is that they can actually do like a lot of different things. So you don't have to necessarily stick with just the examples that I'm using. So to recreate this, I'm going to go back here to my sketch. I'm going to start uh, with a center point and a width and a height for my shape, for my self-portrait. And then I'm going to try to use that as a basis to create the eyes at even intervals and the hair at even intervals like this. And I think I'll stick with that. I think the computer is going to get too complicated. So for today, I'm just going to stick with those basics. Um, and yeah, I'm going to try to go quick because we're getting close to an hour, and I want to give you guys some time to work on your own stuff. But I'll just show you guys what I mean. So to start with, I'm going to create a variable, and this is going to be like the center of my self-portrait. I'm just going to call it X because uh, I'm only using one set of variables. If I had like lots of stuff going on, I would probably need to give it a more specific name. But I want X to be in the middle of my canvas. And so I know my canvas is 400 pixels wide, so I'm going to set X to be 200. And the next thing I'm going to do is basically the same thing with Y. I'm going to say variable Y equals, and then actually my canvas over here is 600, so I want to make this 600. Okay. And then I'm still not dealing with the draw function. We'll probably deal with that next week. So I'm going to take that out and leave in the background. Oh, sorry, my Y is 300. Okay, so now the thing that's cool about a variable is I can take this value and I can use it in my code, and then I can change it and my code will update. Um, and so it's not going to make that much sense until we start to add some stuff in there. But if I want to write the background of my character's head um, with this new code, I'm going to make a comment to say head. And then what did I use for this? I used a big rectangle. Well, actually, I need to do let's do the fill. I think I did plum for the color. I think I changed it a little bit, but I'm just going to go with plum for now. And no stroke. And now I'm going to draw the head. So I had a rectangle, and originally it was like, 200, 300, but now I can replace those values. Let me increase the size a little bit. Now, instead of just writing out 200 and 300, I can put in X and Y, and it's going to do the same thing. So the width and the height of my triangle, I'm just going to grab those from over here real quick. So I'll come back to these in a second. Okay, there's my triangle. I forgot to do rect mode center. So let's copy that and put it over here. Okay, so now I have the X and Y, and they stand in for those values. So if I change this value to 100, now my self-portrait moves over. If I change it to 300, it moves over there. And what's really cool is that I can use code to actually make that interactive or animate it or do other things. So just as a quick example, if I say something simple like X++, but I do it, oh, I don't have a, shoot, now I want to have a draw. I'm going to have a draw for a second. Whoops. And let's tidy this. Okay, so now I've got a moving self-portrait. So that's kind of where we're headed, is being able to do animation. There's a lot of other stuff that I have to do to make this work right, but that's what we've got so far. So let's get rid of these and keep going. So now what I want to do is I want to set other things in my self-portrait relative to where the head is so that they'll move along with the head once I do the animation. And so the next part of my self-portrait is the eyes. I'm going to move this well, I guess I'll leave that here and do something like that. Okay. So now I have the eyes. And what I want to do here is figure out how far away the eyes are from the head and then use that as a basis. So I actually did this math before. I had the circle is 200 plus 65, and this one is 200 minus 65. Um, and I did the same thing over here where I had the height of my self-portrait, but then minus 50. So I've already kind of like figured this out. And so that makes it a lot easier since I did it that way. But if you didn't do it that way, you would basically just want to say like if I hadn't done it this way, this would just be 265. And if I know that the x is 200, then I know that this is the same as 200 plus 65. So I can recreate that. So yeah, but the reason I kind of did it this way last week is to set up how we're going to do this now. So now for my eyes, I can say ellipse, and I can say the same thing, x plus 65 and y minus 50. And what was the height? Or the size is 50. And then the same thing for the other eye, x minus 65, y minus 50, and 50 for the height. And I forgot to change the fill is white. So now I have the eyes. And notice here now if I change x, if I change x to 100, the eyes move with it. If I change x to 300, the eyes move with it because the eyes are relative to the x position. I start with like this x in the middle of the self-portrait here. And then I'm just going plus 65 for one eye and minus 65 for the other eye, and then minus 50 on y. And so if I move this guy from here to here, these relationships stay the same. This height and this width moves here, and so my whole self-portrait moves with the face. Okay, so for the glasses, I had the glasses rims, and that was pretty much the same thing as this, except this was black and this was bigger. This is like 100 or something. And there's no fill, and there's got to be a stroke then. So let's actually change this to stroke, and stroke weight is 10. Okay, so I have the glasses rims. And then let's also do the glasses. Actually, we should do it before the rims. We can do the glasses glass. And so this fill is like 255, 255, 255, and 150 for the transparency. And I guess we need to make it a color. Let's just grab the color from that I used before. I'll just copy this. Huh, I guess we don't really. Am I missing something? Oh, let's make them bigger. That's the problem. Okay, so we need to make these also 100. There we go. Okay. So now we've got the glasses, and notice everything is still relative to x and y because I just copied these over. So everything is x plus 65, y minus 50. And so again, just to keep pointing it out, if I move my y value, everything moves at the same time. And so this is really useful for any type of animation, any game you're going to create where something has to move around. Oh, I see there's a question from Rome. You're able to do any shape for the self-portrait, right? Yes. Yes, any shape is fine. Okay. So I'm just gonna do the hair real quick and then I'll stop for now. Maybe I'll do some more on Wednesday, but I want to give you guys some time to work. But I want to show another thing with the hair, another variable that we can use. So let's go down here and work on our hair. And so the hair is different, right? Because it doesn't have a center. So all of our other shapes have a center, so it's easy to create those offsets. But the hair doesn't have a center. But again, we did write the hair in a way that makes sense. But I'm going to do some calculations to make this work a little bit better. Um, and so what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to find a calculation that works for the hair. So instead of starting from up here, like 100 or whatever, I want to start down here and go backwards so that the hair will move with the self-portrait. So I'm going to have to start with like y minus whatever this is. It's probably um, like half of whatever the height is, which is this 400. So I need some more variables to make this work. So that's one part, is I need to know what this is in order to know what that is. So that's the first part. What's this? And then the second part is I want to draw from here to here, but what happens if I move my self-portrait? All of these things move. So these values, uh, these values, like the x values, are probably going to stay relatively the same. So we'll start with like x minus whatever, x plus whatever. But what's going to change is how far away they are from each other. Um, so this is going to be kind of complicated, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. But let's see if we can get through it, and then I'll let you guys work on your project. Um, so the first thing I want to do is figure out how far away the hair is supposed to be. So let's actually save this number 400 as a variable, and we'll save it as the height. So we'll say variable h as a shorthand for height equals 400. That's the height. And I'm just going to put this h here. And now if I change h, if I change it to like 300, if I make my self-portrait smaller, the hair will move with it. The eyes I didn't do that way, but we can go back and do them later if we want to make it work. And then another thing I'm going to do is what I really want is not the full height, but half the height, because what I really want is this distance here. So the height is this whole distance, that's the height, but this distance from here to here is the height divided by 2. And so I like to save that from the beginning. I usually make a variable called h2, and I just do height divided by 2. When you're designing a character, this is like, we use this so often that it's just easier to just like have it from the beginning. And we might want to use the width at some point, but for now, I'm just going to deal with the height. Okay, so our hair is going to start at, let's do a line. So for the x, let's start at like x minus, let's just do x minus 40, and we'll do it in 10 pixel intervals. So we have the hair is x minus 40, and then y minus h2. And then, so that's going to be the first dot. That's going to be like here, basically. But we need to actually move it up a little bit and move it down a little bit. So we'll say like plus 10. And then we'll say y minus, or so next to x is x minus 30, and y minus h2 plus, or minus 10. Okay, this looks kind of insane, so I'm going to put this on 2 lines so it's easier to read. So our line starts at x minus 40, so x is in the middle, and we're going to go 40 pixels this way. So that'll be like here. And then it goes y minus h2 plus 10. So that's actually down. So we're going to want to flip that, but whatever. So that goes down. And then y minus h2 minus 10 is up here. Okay. And that's just our first, no, that's our whole line. Okay, so there's our line. We didn't get it quite right, but it's good enough. We want our x to go way farther to the side than that. So let's say like x minus 100 and x minus 90. Okay, that's better. Let's do x minus 80 because I don't want to do this 10 times. Okay. And then let's line this up so that it won't let me line it up the way I want it to. Okay, that's fine. that's good enough. Okay, so that's our first hair. So now if I change the height of my character, if I change my character's height to like 200 or 300, notice that the hair goes with it. So that's part of what's useful about this. But then notice this 10 here also. Let's say I'm going to make a couple more lines of hair real quick. So I'm just going to copy this and paste and paste. And all that's going to change with each hair is that the X is going to move. So I should probably use a variable for this, but let's just add to it. So X minus, so we'll just start from 80 and just subtract 20. So 60 and then 40 and then 20 and then 0. This will be the first half. Okay, so there's probably a better way to do the X part, but we're focusing on the Y part right now. So let's get these guys lined up. Unfortunately, formatting gets rid of those things, but for now we can see this. So let's say I wanted to make the hair taller. This is the kind of thing that we should think about with variables is like when I want to do something that I have to like change all these numbers, variables are usually better for that. So anytime that you had like a million lines in a row with like plus blah, 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 that probably is a good sign that a variable will help you here. So if I want to make the hair taller, I have to go to like 20, 20, 20, something like that. Okay, so that doesn't really look like what I want it to look like. And so then I have to change them all again. So when you ever see something like that, you should think to yourself, I bet I could do this with a variable. So I can actually make a variable right here. Normally we put our variables up at the top of the program, but you can put them wherever you want. So I'm just going to do it down here just so I can see it better. So I'm going to say variable hair height, and I'm going to change this number. I'm going to put 10 here. And so now I can take the hair height and just put it in each one of these values. And now if I want to change the hair height, if I want to make it 20, it does all of them at the same time. If I want to make it like 50, it does them all like that. So that's one way that using a variable is like really, really useful, is that now that I have hair height here for each one of these, I don't have to like change all those numbers every time I want to see how it would look different. You might want to have different, different lengths of each one of your hairs, so that would be a different issue. But this solves like creating the hair that way. And another thing I can do here that's even cooler is I can say variable hair height, and I could do something like it equals height, let's say divided by 10. So it's a tenth of the character. So now there's my hair height. It's pretty tall. If I make my character shorter, the hair also changes. So if I make it like 100, notice that the eyes stay the same because they're not relative to the height of the character, but the hair actually changes every time I change the character. So you can do relative values to the height, which gives you a lot to work with in terms of like design, because I can move the character around and I don't have to like move every single thing. I can just say like, oh, let's see how this looks if I move my guy over here. Now the hair moves with it. Same thing with the height. If I change the height, the hair actually changes with it. So you don't have to do it this way, but I want to show you what the advantage of using variables is. For the assignment, you just have to use variables for X and Y and width and height. But I want to show you guys some more, so you don't have to do like more complicated stuff like this, but I want to show you some of the advantages of using this style of programming will do. So let's format this and let's finish the hair, and then I'll let you guys start working on your own. I'm going to move this out a little bit. So I'm just going to copy this a couple more times and then keep going with my x's. So x is 0 here, so we're going to flip to plus 20 here and x plus 40 here. And now this is x plus 60 and x plus 80. And I guess I would have one more here, x plus 100 and x plus 120. Is that going to go over? It's a little bit off, but whatever, it's good enough. So yeah, I'll do a little bit more on Wednesday, but that's the basic idea here. So I know some of that stuff was probably kind of complicated. I wanted to show you guys a few different ways of approaching variables, but the main thing that you have to worry about for today is just this XY part, getting XY and applying it to the basic shape that you have for your self-portrait so that you can move the self-portrait around. So that's pretty much what we're focusing on this week. Um, any questions on any of that at the moment? Cool. Okay, so we have like 25 minutes left in class. I'll let you guys get to work. We'll do the debugging stuff on Wednesday. It's going to be, it's a little bit packed in this week, but as we're starting to write real code, you're going to come across errors. So like you're going to see stuff that looks like this. Like if I put in a space here, you're going to get errors that look like this. And so we want to go over how to deal with those errors before we get into more complicated programming. So that's what we're going to do on Wednesday. But we also will have some time for you guys to continue working on the variables assignment. Um, and so yeah, don't worry if your self-portrait doesn't look exactly like the original that you did, or if it doesn't have the same amount of detail. What I'm really looking for is just that you have variables plugged into the right places, and that they work. So that's the focus for this week. And next week we'll be adding animation, so we'll be or interaction with the self-portrait, so that'll be a little bit more interesting, and that'll be taking advantage of the variables that we're creating this week. So I'm going to